Officer Blake sat in his patrol car. The afternoon sun was glaring through his windshield, and he had to squint his eyes to see clearly. Blake scanned the parking lot as the car's engine purred quietly. He was restless, and the quiet suburban neighborhood wasn't doing much to ease his growing frustration. Patrol duty today had been exactly the type he dreaded, completely uneventful and boring. He had spent the better half of his morning staring at the occasional car pulling in or a pedestrian hurrying into one of the shops in the strip mall. Blake grunted in frustration. Could this day get any worse? He muttered to himself as he leaned back in the car seat, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. The neighborhood was a nice area, the kind of place where people liked things to stay that way. Most of the residents here looked like him, which made Blake feel at home. But just because it was comfortable didn't mean he wasn't alert. He was always watching. His eyes landed on a man who was standing outside the entrance of a cafe. He was a tall black man in a sharp navy suit. The man stood confidently with his eyes slowly scanning his surroundings. Blake couldn't help but wonder what a black man was doing in a neighborhood where most people were white. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just scrolling through his phone. But something about him being so relaxed didn't sit right with Blake. His jaw tightened. Blake had seen this kind of thing before. People didn't just stand around in parking lots for no reason. They were either waiting for something or causing trouble. He couldn't shake the feeling that this man didn't fit in. Maybe he was casing the place, waiting for the right moment. Or maybe he was dealing drugs or stolen goods, keeping his operation discreet so as not to raise suspicion. Blake took a deep breath as he felt the familiar adrenaline creeping in. He wasn't about to let something happen on his watch. Not here. The man glanced up from his phone, his eyes briefly looking toward Blake's patrol car. He didn't flinch, didn't seem nervous. If anything, he looked even more relaxed, like he had nothing to hide. And that was the most vexing part for Blake. People were supposed to be nervous around a cop. It showed respect, an acknowledgement of authority. But this guy, he acted like Blake wasn't even there. Blake straightened up in his seat, his eyes narrowing. Enough was enough. He reached for the door handle, swinging it open harder than he needed to. The slam echoed in the quiet parking lot, but the man barely gave him a glance. Blake walked toward him, boots thudding against the pavement. As he got closer, he sized the man up, clean-shaven, mid-30s maybe, standing confidently like he wasn't used to being questioned. That kind of confidence rubbed Blake the wrong way, especially as it came from someone who didn't seem to belong here. The man glanced up as Blake walked toward him, one eyebrow arched in confusion, his face a mask of mild curiosity. "Afternoon," he said, politely enough. He slipped his phone into his pocket. There wasn't any tension in his voice, just calm professionalism. Blake didn't bother with pleasantries. He stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on his utility belt. "What are you doing here?" Blake asked, his tone sharp. The man didn't blink. If anything, he seemed confused. "Excuse me?" "I asked what you're doing here," Blake repeated, his voice hardening. "This is private property. You can't just stand around if you don't have business here." The man stayed composed, unfazed by Blake's tone. "I'm waiting for someone," he said evenly. "Is there a problem, officer?" That question, is there a problem? It always felt like a challenge. Blake's temper flared, but his voice didn't betray it. "Yeah, there is a problem," Blake said, his voice firm as he stepped closer. "People usually don't just hang out in parking lots for good reasons. If you're not here for a good reason, you need to move along." The man let out a soft sigh as he shook his head. "I already told you. I'm waiting for someone." Blake could feel his frustration growing, tension coiling tight in his chest. This man was too calm and relaxed. It was as though he completely didn't care that Blake was the authority and that he was obligated to answer him. "And who exactly are you waiting for?" Blake asked, his voice darkening. The man didn't break eye contact. "A friend," he said simply. "We're meeting for coffee." He nodded toward the cafe behind him. There was a placard in the window advertising lattes and pastries. Blake's jaw clamped down. There was just something about this encounter that didn't sit right with him. Not that the man was being disrespectful, but it was this calmness, the lack of rattle within his composure, that was a challenge in itself. Like he wasn't taking this seriously. "I need to see some ID," Blake said, trying to maintain authority in this scenario. Blake was close enough now to catch the faint, lingering hint of aftershave hanging in the air. The man's brow arched, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Really?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yeah, really. I don't see how this should be a problem if you have nothing to hide." For the first time, the man hesitated. His hand moved toward his pocket, then stopped. He studied Blake's face for a moment, weighing his next move. Blake's pulse quickened. He'd seen this before. Someone hesitating meant they were hiding something. Maybe this guy wasn't just here for coffee. Maybe there was more going on. "I don't see why you need my ID," the man said slowly, his voice firm but quiet. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've already told you why I'm here." Blake's patience snapped. "This isn't a debate," he growled. "I'm asking for your ID and you will give it to me. Now." The man stared straight at him, but he didn't argue. Blake noticed his shoulders slump in resignation. "Fine," he muttered as he slowly reached into his jacket. Blake watched his every move as his hands hovered near his belt, in case the man wanted to play games with him. The man pulled his wallet out but didn't hand over the ID immediately. Instead, he held it by his side, meeting Blake's gaze with a steely intensity. "What's your name?" the man asked, his voice quiet but firm. Blake's eyes widened. "I'm the one asking the questions," he snapped. "Just show me the ID." The man didn't blink. "I'm happy to cooperate, officer. But first, I'd like to know the name of the person who decided that standing outside a cafe equals loitering." Blake's blood boiled. The nerve of this guy, flipping the situation on him like he was the one out of line. He was done playing games. "Name's Officer Blake," he growled. "Now you show me your identification, or I am taking you in for refusing to comply." The man pressed his lips into a thin line, and for a second, Blake thought he might argue. But then he nodded, handing over the ID. Blake snatched it from him, barely glancing at it. He was about to remark on compliance, but before he could get the words out, the man's voice sliced through the tension as cleanly as a knife. "And just so we're crystal clear," he said softly, his eyes locked on Blake's, "this won't go unnoticed." Blake's heart skipped a beat, uncertainty flickering in his mind. But he quickly buried it, pocketing the ID and stepping back. "You can go," he muttered, his voice bitter. As he walked back to his patrol car, Blake couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his gut. This wasn't like dealing with some drunk on a street corner. And something told him this wasn't over yet. Officer Blake knew something was off, but he couldn't tell what was wrong exactly. His eyes were glued to the man standing near the entrance of the cafe. There was something about that guy, something that tensed Blake's muscles and made his mind race. Blake's radio crackled softly in the patrol car, but he ignored it. The sun was low in the sky now, stretching shadows out across the nearly deserted parking lot. There was still time to get answers, still time to figure out what was going on. He drummed his fingers across the hood of his patrol car, before heaving himself off and walking back toward the man. Heavy boots thudded against the pavement as he crossed the lot, his eyes held on his target, his heart beating loudly. This guy wasn't like the others Blake had dealt with. Most people would have already tried to leave or make excuses by now. Not this one. The man glanced up from his phone again as Blake neared, his gaze steady. He didn't look nervous or out of place, but his confidence set Blake on edge. "Hey," Blake barked, stopping a few feet away. "I thought I told you to move along." The man didn't react immediately. He blinked, his gaze calm, before slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. He turned toward Blake, standing tall. His well-fitted suit and polished shoes suggested he wasn't just some random guy loitering. "Officer," the man said evenly, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge. "Is there a reason you're talking to me like this?" Blake bristled. "Yeah," he shot back. "You've been standing around here long enough. People are starting to get suspicious." The man's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't lose his composure. "Suspicious?" he repeated, still steady. "I'm waiting for a friend. I didn't realize standing outside a cafe was cause for concern." Blake stepped closer, his jaw tight. It is when you're hanging around where you don't belong. The man's expression shifted, subtly, but Blake caught it. His dark eyes sharpened, his posture stiffened just a little. "And what exactly makes you think I don't belong here, officer?" Blake's pulse quickened. There it was again, that tone. The man was challenging him, pushing back, and it annoyed Blake's more than anything. "You've got an attitude," Blake said, his voice low with dangerous intent. "You think this is a joke?" The man let out a soft sigh, shaking his head. "Look, I'm not here looking for trouble. My name's Jamal, and like I said, I'm just waiting for a friend." Blake's frustration flared. "Jamal, huh? Well, you're not acting like someone with nothing to hide. People who have nothing to worry about don't push back when a cop asks questions." Jamal's jaw clenched, but his eyes stayed steady on Blake's. "I've answered your questions, officer. I'm just meeting a friend here. If that's a crime, let me know. Otherwise, I'd like to mind my own business." Blake's temper spiked. The way Jamal stood there got under his skin. Blake wasn't used to people standing their ground like this, and he wasn't about to let Jamal walk away without reminding him who was in charge here. "I don't like your tone," Blake snapped, stepping closer until he was nearly chest to chest with Jamal. "And I don't like your attitude." Jamal remained still, not flinching. His voice was low but even. "Officer, I am not being disrespectful. I'm just standing here, minding my business. You're the one escalating things." Blake's fists clenched. Escalating things? To Blake, he was only doing his job. He had to make sure the streets were peaceful and that people like this black man stayed in their lanes. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job," Blake growled. "You're acting like you're untouchable, like you're above being questioned. That's not how this works." Jamal sighed, glancing around the parking lot as if checking if anyone was watching. "I don't think I'm above anything, officer. I respect the law, and I respect you. But I also know my rights. I'm not doing anything wrong, so unless you have a reason to detain me, I'd like to end this conversation." Blake's vision blurred with anger. The words, "I know my rights," always meant trouble. Jamal was getting too comfortable, too confident. Blake hated that. He wanted to shake that confidence, to remind this guy who held the power here. "Your rights, huh?" Blake sneered. "How about this? You give me a reason not to haul you in for loitering and obstruction, because you're testing my patience." Jamal's calm exterior finally cracked slightly. His brow furrowed and his jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Officer, I'm not loitering. I told you, I'm here for a meeting. And obstruction? What exactly am I obstructing?" Blake's was visibly furious now, his heart pounding harder. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" he spat. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Jamal's eyes darkened. "No," he said, voice low but steady. "I think I'm being harassed for standing in a parking lot." For a moment, Blake froze. He had not expected the word harassment to be thrown into the exchange. He wasn't harassing anyone. He was doing his job, keeping an eye on someone who didn't belong. But as he stared at Jamal, he felt something about him was not right. This wasn't going how Blake had expected. Jamal wasn't crumbling under pressure. He wasn't backing down or getting scared. If anything, his confidence had only grown, and Blake didn't know how to handle that. "Look," Jamal said quietly, trying to defuse the situation. "I'm not trying to make this into something it's not. I just want to wait for my friend in peace. I don't want trouble." Blake's hands tightened into fists at his sides. Trouble? Jamal didn't get to decide if there was trouble. Blake did, and he wasn't about to let this man walk away without answering for his defiance. "You want peace?" Blake snapped, stepping closer, towering over Jamal. "Then you'd better start showing me some respect, because right now you're walking a fine line." Jamal's eyes flicked to Blake's hand resting near his baton. For the first time, a hint of tension crept into his expression, but it wasn't fear. It was anger. Controlled, but anger nonetheless. "I've been nothing but respectful," Jamal said, his voice tight. "But if you're looking to start something, I'm not going to play along." Blake's breath hitched. There it was, the challenge he'd been waiting for. The defiance. He could feel the confrontation reaching a boiling point, the weight of his authority pressing on him, pushing him to act, to remind Jamal who was in charge here. "Is that so?" Blake growled. "Maybe you don't understand the situation you're in." Jamal's eyes flashed, but he didn't back down. "I understand it perfectly, officer. The question is, do you?" For one fleeting second, the clutch of nerves in Blake's chest constricted into panic. This is getting out of hand. Jamal wasn't reacting the way he was supposed to, and the more Jamal stood his ground, the more Blake felt like the ground was slipping beneath his own feet. Blake clenched his jaw, feeling the pressure of authority, the need to act, to show Jamal who was in charge. But before he could say another word, the door to the cafe opened, and a voice interrupted the tension. "Jamal?" Both men turned to see a middle-aged woman stepping out of the cafe, her eyes wide with concern. She glanced between Blake and Jamal. "Jamal, is everything all right?" she asked. Jamal glanced at Blake before turning back to the woman. "Everything's fine, Ms. Davis," he said calmly. Jamal turned toward the woman who had just emerged from the cafe. Her graying hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she clutched a leather satchel close to her chest, as though the tension in the air between Jamal and Officer Blake had drawn her out of the safety of the cafe. "Ms. Davis, everything's under control," Jamal said smoothly, keeping his voice calm despite the rising tension. His eyes, however, never left Blake, watching the officer's every move. Still standing in the cafe doorway, Ms. Davis frowned, glancing between Jamal and Officer Blake. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone polite, but tinged with the wariness of someone who'd seen situations like this before. Blake barely spared her a glance. His focus was on Jamal, the anger inside him refusing to ease. Jamal had been nothing but calm, even polite, but something about his demeanor unsettled Blake. Jamal hadn't backed down or shown any fear, the kind of quiet confidence that Blake hated. It made him feel like he was losing control, and losing control was not an option for Blake. "You know this man?" Blake asked, his voice thick with suspicion as he finally shifted his gaze to Ms. Davis. His hand hovered near his baton, fingers twitching with tension. Ms. Davis looked at Jamal and then back at Blake. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice firm. "He's my business associate. We were meeting here today. Is there a problem?" Blake's jaw tightened. He didn't like where this was going. "Ma'am," Blake said, his voice hardening, "I'm conducting an investigation here. I've asked your associate several times why he's standing around this parking lot, and I'm not satisfied with the answers I'm getting." Ms. Davis's expression darkened slightly. "He's waiting for me, officer. We have a meeting. There's no crime in standing outside a cafe, is there?" "I'm not done here," Blake snapped, his frustration boiling over. He took a step toward Jamal, his voice rising with each word. "You're loitering here, obstructing my investigation, and now you're dragging this woman into your mess." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "My mess?" he repeated. "Officer, I'm not causing a mess. I've answered your questions." Blake's nostrils flared. The calm in Jamal's voice was gone, replaced by a quiet frustration that mirrored Blake's own rising anger. But unlike Blake, Jamal didn't raise his voice or lose control. He spoke with a firmness that only made Blake feel more annoyed. Ms. Davis seemed to sense the shift in the air. She stepped closer to Jamal, her voice softer but still firm. "Officer," she said gently, "this doesn't need to continue. We've explained ourselves. We're not breaking any laws, and we're not causing any trouble. Can't this be resolved without any more issues?" Blake's hand twitched again near his baton. He wanted to lash out, to demand respect, to force them to acknowledge his authority. But the way they stood there, calm, united, made him feel small, as if he were the one being backed into a corner. By now, people passing by the parking lot had started to notice the tense interaction. A few pedestrians slowed down, watching with uncertainty, while others gave the scene a wide berth. This only heightened Blake's agitation. He couldn't afford to lose face in front of civilians. "Look," Blake growled, pointing at Jamal. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you can stand there, act cool, like you've got nothing to worry about." Blake stepped forward, lowering his voice to a growl. "You better watch yourself, pal. You don't want to push me too far." Jamal held his gaze unflinching. "I've been respectful, officer, but I'm not going to let you intimidate me. You're out of line." The words "out of line" rang in Blake's ears like a challenge. He wasn't out of line. He was doing his job. And then, as if to add insult, Ms. Davis stepped forward again, her voice quiet but firm. "Officer, this is enough. You're harassing us now, and I won't stand for it. If you want to continue this, I suggest you call your superior." The words hit Blake like a punch to the gut. She was undermining him, suggesting he wasn't capable of handling the situation. He couldn't let this go like this. But before Blake could respond, Jamal took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Blake's with sharp intensity. For the first time, Blake felt a flicker of doubt. "Officer Blake," Jamal said quietly, his voice so calm it was unsettling. "This is going to stop now. You've crossed a line, and I'm done playing along." People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. His fingers twitched near his baton, his body tense with the need to act. But Jamal's next words sliced through the tension. Blake's mouth went dry. The authority in Jamal's voice felt like a shift in power, and it rattled him. For the first time, Blake felt like he wasn't in control. Jamal was. Ms. Davis rested a hand on Jamal's arm, her voice a soft whisper. "Jamal, it's all right. Let's go inside." But Jamal didn't budge. His eyes were still locked on Blake. "Not yet," he said firmly. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Blake's hand twitched near his baton, but he didn't move. Jamal had taken control of the situation, and for the first time, Blake wasn't sure what to do. Jamal's eyes shifted to Blake's hand, hovering a little too close to his baton. A muscle in Jamal's jaw tightened, but he didn't budge. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, staring at Blake with that same unbreakable calm, like he was daring the officer to step over the line. Ms. Davis was still beside Jamal, her hand resting on his arm, though the tension in her posture gave away her nerves. She glanced anxiously between the two men, clearly feeling the danger in the air. Jamal took a slow, deliberate step closer, his voice dropping into a low, steady tone. "I've tried to keep this civil," he said, his eyes locked on Blake's. "I've answered your questions. I've cooperated, but you keep pushing. I don't know why, but you need to understand something." He paused, his words hanging in the air. "You don't intimidate me." The words hit Blake like a slap. For a second, he didn't know what to say. Blake's heart pounded, and his fingers twitched near his baton again. He was at a tipping point. He could push harder, force control. But something about Jamal's tone, the way he stood, made Blake hesitate. This wasn't like other times. Something about Jamal made Blake feel exposed, like he was the one under scrutiny. Ms. Davis finally stepped in, her voice soft but firm. "Jamal," she said, "let's just go inside. We don't need this." Jamal didn't take his eyes off Blake. "You're right," he said softly. "We don't." Blake felt Jamal's gaze on him as he turned and led Ms. Davis toward the cafe doors. The moment seemed to stretch painfully, every second drawing out, as Blake stood there watching them leave. His fists clenched at his sides, his chest tight as he struggled to keep his composure. Just as Jamal reached the door, he paused. For a second, Blake thought he might turn around, say something to reignite the tension, but instead, Jamal just glanced over his shoulder, his eyes locking with Blake's one last time. "I'll remember this, Officer Blake," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight heavier than any threat. "And so will you." With that, Jamal stepped inside, leaving Blake standing in silence. Inside the cafe, Jamal let out a slow breath, his body finally relaxing. He hadn't wanted it to go that far, hadn't wanted to provoke the officer, but Blake had forced his hand. From the moment their interaction began, Jamal knew Blake had come at him because of the color of his skin. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe bustling around them. The barista called out orders, customers chatted and laughed, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. But for Jamal, the tension with Officer Blake still hung in the air, like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Ms. Davis glanced toward the window, where Blake's patrol car sat parked, the officer still pacing nearby. "You think he'll try something else?" Jamal followed her gaze, watching Blake. "Maybe," he said after a beat, "but he doesn't want the attention. He knows he crossed a line." Ms. Davis shook her head. "Guys like him, they don't change, do they?" Jamal took a deep breath. "I don't know," he said after a pause, "but I'm going to make sure he's held accountable for his actions." Jamal's thoughts were already running through what needed to happen next. This wouldn't be the last time he saw Blake. The officer had shown his true colors, and Jamal wasn't going to just let it slide. He knew how the system worked. He'd dealt with it before, and this time, Blake was going to have to answer for his actions. Ms. Davis touched his arm again, her voice soft. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. It wasn't right." Jamal shrugged, though the bitterness sat heavy in his chest. "It never is." Jamal's mind replayed the confrontation. It was a pattern he'd seen too many times, but this time he wasn't going to just let it pass. "I'll file a report," Jamal said, his voice steady. He crossed a line. He has to be held accountable. Ms. Davis nodded again. I'll back you up. Jamal smiled at her, thankful for the support. Meanwhile, Blake was still pacing near his car outside. Jamal watched him for a moment longer, then turned away. Blake had tried to make him feel small, tried to scare him, but it hadn't worked. Jamal had faced worse before, and Blake wasn't going to be the one to break him. The afternoon sun sank lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Blake could not forget Jamal's last words before entering the cafe. I'll remember this. Blake clenched his teeth as the words echoed in his head. It felt like a challenge, a threat even. How dare Jamal act like he had any power in that situation? Blake was the one with the badge, the authority. He enforced the law. But Jamal had walked away as if he were in charge, leaving Blake standing there humiliated, exposed. He slammed his fist onto the hood of the patrol car. Blake glanced toward the cafe window. Through the glass, he could see Jamal sitting at a table with Ms. Davis. The two spoke quietly, their expressions serious, but calm. Blake's anger flared again. Jamal had played him, acted like the reasonable one, the victim. Now he was probably twisting the story to Ms. Davis, making Blake out to be the bad guy. Blake couldn't let that happen. Not with all those onlookers, and not with the department already keeping an eye on him after past complaints. He needed to take control. He needed to show Jamal, and everyone else, that he was still in charge. He paced a few more steps, his mind racing. This wasn't over. He just needed to be smart about it. Blake took a deep breath as he straightened his uniform and pulled his hat down. He didn't care if it looked like he was doubling down. Jamal had left him no choice. Blake walked toward the cafe, his boots striking the pavement with hard, deliberate steps. His hand rested on his utility belt, fingers brushing the handle of his baton. He wasn't going to let Jamal walk away from this without any consequence. As he reached the door, he pushed it open harder than necessary, the bell above it jingling loudly. The smell of freshly brewed coffee hit him, but it did nothing to calm his nerves. The murmur of conversation died down as heads turned. Jamal and Ms. Davis were still seated at the same table. Jamal looked up as Blake approached their table. He didn't say anything. Blake stopped in front of their table, his posture rigid, his presence looming over them like a storm cloud. The air between them felt thick with tension, a weight pressing down on everyone in the cafe. "Can I help you, officer?" Jamal asked, his tone measured but with a hint of irritation. He kept his voice low, trying not to disturb the other patrons. Blake ignored the question, narrowing his eyes at Jamal. "We're not done," he said, his voice low but edged with menace. "You think you can just walk away from me? Like that?" Blake's hand twitched near his baton, adrenaline rushing through him. The tension was rising again, even more charged than before. "I want answers," Blake growled, his voice growing louder. A few heads turned, and the cafe grew quieter. "You're hiding something. I don't know what, but you're hiding something. No one stands around in a parking lot like that unless they're up to something." Jamal sighed, his calm demeanor finally showing signs of strain. "I'm not hiding anything," he said, voice clipped. "I already gave you my ID, which you're yet to check. I explained why I was there. What more do you want?" Blake leaned forward, his face inches from Jamal's. His eyes burned with frustration, his need to reassert authority, to get some reaction. "I don't trust your kind," Blake spat. "And I don't like your attitude." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Officer Blake," he said slowly, enunciating each word, "you're out of line. I'm not the problem here. You are." Ms. Davis, silent until now, spoke up, her voice firm. "Officer, this has gone far enough. We've done nothing wrong. If you continue to harass us, we'll report you." Blake's temper flared. Harass? She thought he was harassing them? He was doing his job. His fist was clenched at his side with so much anger boiling within him. Before he could say anything, Jamal rose to his feet, slowly rising to full height. The tension in the air became suffocating. Blake's heart thundered in his ears. He felt the eyes of everyone in the cafe on him, watching and waiting for his response. His heart was racing, his fists clenched, his body tense to act. But something held him back. Something in the way Jamal stood, calm, composed, unafraid, made Blake hesitate. There was a quiet power in Jamal's stance, something Blake couldn't touch. Blake opened his mouth to snap back, but before he could speak, Jamal reached into his jacket pocket. Blake's hand flew to his baton, muscles tensing for confrontation. But instead of a weapon, Jamal pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. Holding it out, his eyes locked on Blake's. He flipped it open with a quiet click. The badge inside gleamed in the soft light of the cafe. Its golden letters unmistakable. FBI. Blake's breath caught in his throat. His body went cold. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. But then, the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. Jamal was a federal agent. The world tilted around Blake as the weight of his mistake downed on him. His heart raced, but this time with fear. The cafe had fallen silent. Jamal's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I tried to tell you, officer," he said softly, "but you wouldn't listen." Blake's mouth went dry. His mind raced, searching for a way out. But there was no fixing this. He had gone too far. Jamal tucked the wallet back into his jacket, his expression calm. "This isn't over, there will be consequences," he said quietly. Blake could feel the walls closing in on him. The noise of the cafe faded beneath the pounding in his ears. His breath was shallow as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on him. Jamal stood there, cool and composed, every inch in control. The power between them had flipped so hard, Blake could hardly stand it. This wasn't just about rank anymore. It was about the colossal screw-up Blake had just made. He hadn't just disrespected a federal agent. He'd harassed him. The silence stretched on for a minute. Blake felt every eye in the cafe locked on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down. His reputation, his career, everything was hanging by a thread. He could practically hear the whispers already starting, the disbelief that would soon ripple through the precinct and beyond. Blake, the officer who never backed down, had pushed too far. And now, he was about to pay for it. Jamal's voice broke through the tension, cutting into Blake's panic. "I warned you, officer," he said quietly. "You had every chance to back off." Blake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? Jamal wasn't just some guy in a suit. He was someone with real power, someone who could end Blake's career with a single report. And Blake had given him every reason to do just that. Ms. Davis, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. Her tone was firm, her eyes cold. "This should have never gotten this far," she said, looking between Jamal and Blake. "But it did. And now, officer, there are going to be consequences." Blake's stomach twisted. Consequences. He could already see the fallout. An internal affairs investigation, the media catching wind, public outrage. Blake knew his superiors wouldn't hesitate to throw him under the bus. Jamal slowly sat back down with his eyes never leaving Blake. His expression was unreadable, but the look he gave said everything. Blake knew he was in trouble. A federal agent filing a complaint against him will destroy what was left of his career in the department. Blake stepped back, his mind racing, searching for some way to salvage this, to apologize, to beg if necessary. But the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say that would fix this? Jamal watched him closely, reading every bit of fear and desperation on Blake's face. "You crossed a line," Jamal said, his tone still even, still calm. "And now, you're going to answer for it." That was it. There was no turning this around, no way to undo what had been done. Blake had pushed too far, and now Jamal was letting him know there was no easy escape. Finally, Blake managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look, I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know you were with the FBI." Jamal raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. "That shouldn't have mattered," he replied. "You didn't treat me that way because of my badge. You treated me that way because of how I look. Isn't that right?" Blake felt the shame wash over him, unable to meet Jamal's gaze. He knew there was no point in denying it. The way he'd acted, the aggression, it all came from the same place. And now, there was no running from that truth. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Blake muttered, but the words felt hollow, empty. Even as he said them, he knew they didn't matter. What mattered was that it had gone too far. And now, the consequences were staring him in the face. Jamal's expression didn't soften. "That's the issue, officer," he said quietly. "It never should have started in the first place." Blake's hands trembled as he took another step back. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating. All the confidence, all the bravado that had carried him into this confrontation had vanished, leaving only dread in its place. Ms. Davis stood up, her face unreadable. "You've made a serious mistake," she said, her voice like ice. "And now you're going to have to deal with the consequences." Blake could barely breathe. The word consequences hung in the air, suffocating him. He knew what was coming. There was no escaping it. His career, his reputation, everything was on the line, and there was no one to blame but himself. Jamal stood, commanding but not arrogant. "I'll be in touch with your department," he said evenly. "You'll hear from us soon." With that, Jamal turned and walked toward the door, Ms. Davis right behind him. Blake stood there, frozen, watching them leave. He had never felt so powerless in his life. The door of the cafe swung shut behind Jamal and Ms. Davis. The soft jingle of the bell barely broke through the pounding in Blake's ears. He stood frozen, his mind racing yet completely blank. The word FBI echoed in his head, getting louder until it drowned everything else out. Blake couldn't move. He felt like his whole world had tilted, and he was teetering on the edge, ready to fall. He wanted to do something, anything, but didn't know where to start. Blake had just spent the last hour treating a federal agent like a common criminal. Now, there was no way to take it back, no way to fix it. The cafe buzzed with quiet murmurs as people resumed their conversations. Their eyes still darted in his direction. Blake felt their judgment pressing down on him. It made his skin crawl. They had seen everything. Every moment of his humiliation. Every mistake. Some had their phones out, snapping pictures or recording the scene. They wouldn't forget this. Neither would his precinct. Blake's throat tightened as the weight of his situation actually dawned on him. All he could think about was Jamal's eyes when he revealed his badge. That calm authority. Jamal hadn't shouted or threatened him. He had just shown Blake who he really was. In that moment, everything had changed. For a second, Blake thought about chasing after Jamal to explain himself. But what could he say? I didn't know? That would only make things worse. Jamal had been right. It didn't matter if Blake knew. What mattered was why he had treated him that way. And deep down, Blake knew the answer. He just wasn't ready to admit it to anyone else. Not yet. His legs felt heavy as he finally turned and walked out of the cafe. He could feel the stairs burning holes in his back as he walked to the door. The late afternoon air hit him as he stepped outside, but it didn't help with the fog in his mind. As he stood on the sidewalk, glancing around the parking lot, he sighed. He had been hoping to see Jamal's car still there, but of course, it was gone. Jamal was gone, and Blake was left standing alone. He forced himself to move, dragging his feet back to his patrol car. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the door handle. His body reacted to the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He sat heavily in the driver's seat, slamming the door shut harder than he intended. He stared at the steering wheel. His mind was a chaotic jumble of thoughts. He needed to call it in. He had to get ahead of this before Jamal's report reached his department. But what was he supposed to say? "Hey, Chief. I just harassed an FBI agent for no reason. Thought you should know." Ah! His fingers hovered over the radio, but he couldn't pick it up. Fear clawed at his chest, tightening around his lungs. If he called it in, it would be over. His career, his reputation, everything. It was already hanging by a thread after previous complaints. But this would be the final nail in the coffin. There would be no coming back from this. Blake swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't shake the image of Jamal's calm face, the authority in his voice. Jamal had been in control the whole time. Blake had been too blinded by anger and prejudice to see it. Jamal hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gotten defensive, yet he commanded the situation with a quiet power Blake couldn't understand. And then, when Blake had pushed too far, Jamal had dropped the hammer. Blake squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memory away. He had seen that badge, the one thing Blake couldn't fight against. In that moment, everything had changed. Jamal had all the power, and Blake had been left exposed. With a shaky breath, Blake leaned back in his seat, still spinning. He couldn't stop thinking about how he had treated Jamal. This wasn't the first time he had acted like this. There had been other incidents, other complaints, but they'd always been brushed aside. Blake was a good cop, and the fact that he always got results made him popular in the precinct. The higher-ups never asked too many questions about how he got those results. But this time was different. Jamal wasn't just some kid on the street. He wasn't someone who would disappear after this. Jamal was a federal agent. Now Blake's actions would be scrutinized by people with far more power than he'd ever imagined. The thought made Blake's stomach turn. He had gone too far, and there was no talking his way out of this one. Jamal had every reason to file that report. When he did, it would set off a chain of events that Blake couldn't stop. His fingers hovered over the radio again, but this time he slowly pulled his hand back. There was nothing to say, nothing he could do to change what had happened. All he could do was wait and hope that somehow, some way, things wouldn't get as bad as he feared. But deep down, Blake knew better. He had seen the look on Jamal's face. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, Jamal walked away from the cafe, his mind clear and focused. From the moment Officer Blake first approached him, Jamal had known this wasn't just about loitering or suspicion. He had seen it in Blake's eyes, the quick judgment, the aggression, the unwillingness to listen. It was the same pattern Jamal had seen many times before. It always led to the same outcome, a misuse of power rooted in prejudice. But this time, Jamal had the power. He had used it, not to belittle Blake or humiliate him, but to remind him that actions like his have consequences. Jamal had worked too hard and come too far to let someone like Blake undermine him because of the color of his skin. He had fought this fight before, and he wasn't afraid to fight it again. "Are you okay?" Ms. Davis asked as they reached her car. She had been quiet during the walk back, but Jamal could see the concern on her face. "I'm fine," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." Ms. Davis gave him a weak smile. "It shouldn't have to be something you deal with at all." Jamal smiled slightly. "No, it shouldn't," he agreed. "But that's the reality of life." He opened the passenger door for her, then walked around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, his mind went back to that moment in the cafe, when Blake realized just how badly he had messed up. Jamal had seen that look before too. The panic, the fear, the sudden understanding that the rules had changed. Jamal had no intention of letting this go. Blake would be held accountable. There would be an official report, and the department would have to answer for their officer's conduct. Jamal wasn't interested in ruining Blake's life, but he wanted to make sure that people like him, those who abused their authority, didn't get away with it. As he pulled out of the parking lot, Jamal exhaled slowly, releasing the tension from the confrontation. He wasn't angry anymore. He was resolute. Blake would learn from this. One way or another, things were about to change. Blake sat in his patrol car, staring blankly at the dashboard as time passed by. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the parking lot, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His mind was a mess, replaying the events of the last hour over and over. He still couldn't believe what had happened. "An FBI agent," Blake murmured to himself. He knew Jamal was going to file a report, and Blake knew exactly what that meant: an internal investigation. They'd go over every detail of what happened, and it wouldn't take long to figure out Blake had crossed the line. Again. But this time, it was different. There was no hiding it. He'd gone after a federal agent, and there was no undoing that. The badge Jamal flashed wasn't just a badge. It was the key to Blake's undoing. It carried power that made Blake's look small in comparison, and Jamal now held all the cards. Blake had spent his career towing the line, pushing limits, trusting his instincts to lead him. He took pride in knowing when trouble was brewing, when someone didn't seem to fit. But now, for the first time, he was starting to see cracks in his judgment, and the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. The radio in his patrol car crackled, snapping him out of his fog. The dispatcher's voice broke through the static, calling his badge number. "Unit 12, come in. Unit 12, respond." Blake reached for the radio, his hand shaking as he grabbed it. He hesitated, his mouth dry, then pressed the button. "This is Unit 12, he said, his voice rough. "Unit 12, Chief Roberts wants you back at the station. Now." That was fast, he said to himself. There was no other reason why the chief would be calling him back to the station while on duty. The meaning was clear. The chief knew. The investigation had probably already started. It wasn't just hanging over him anymore. It had begun. Blake swallowed hard, gripping the radio tighter. "Copy that," he said, barely holding it together. He set the receiver down and leaned back in his seat, staring at the sky. This was it. The beginning of the end. Back at the station, things felt different. The usual noise of officers talking and moving around was muted, like everyone could feel the weight of what was coming. Blake walked in, each step heavy, his mind clouded with worry. His coworkers glanced at him as he passed, some confused on why he was back early from patrol, but none of them knew what had really happened yet. It felt like walking through a minefield. They knew he was in trouble, but not how deep. Not yet. He pushed open the door to Chief Roberts' office, the hinges squeaking in the quiet hallway. The chief, a big guy with gray hair and a face worn from years of stress, looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit down, Blake," the chief said, his voice flat. Blake sank into the chair across from him, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The tension was thick, pressing down on him. He had been in the chief's office before, but it had never felt like this. This was serious. "What happened out there?" the chief asked, eyes narrowing slightly. Blake hesitated, scrambling to figure out how to explain. He couldn't tell the whole truth, but he couldn't lie either. The truth would come out, one way or another. "There was a guy," Blake started, his voice unsteady. "In the parking lot. He looked suspicious. I thought he might be up to something." The chief raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? What was suspicious about him?" Blake's heart pounded. He didn't have a good answer for that. Jamal hadn't done anything wrong. He had just been standing there. But Blake had seen something else. Something he wanted to see. "He was hanging around," Blake said weakly. "Didn't answer my questions right away. I thought—" "Didn't answer your questions," the chief cut in, his voice sharper now. "Or didn't answer them the way you wanted." Blake's mouth went dry and he couldn't meet the chief's eyes. He knew where this was heading. I didn't know he was FBI," Blake mumbled. "That's the issue, Blake," the chief said, leaning forward, his eyes hard. "It shouldn't matter who he was. You shouldn't have gone that far. From what I've heard, this wasn't just asking a few questions. You harassed the poor man for hours. You crossed the line." Blake's heart sank. The walls were closing in. "I was doing my job," he said, but the words felt empty. The chief shook his head. "You've had complaints before. We let them go. But this is different. He's already filed a formal complaint. Internal Affairs is on this, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Blake felt the blood drain from his face. Internal Affairs. The words echoed in his head. He'd heard stories of other officers going through it, and most didn't come out clean. "I can't protect you this time," the chief said, his voice heavy. "It's out of my hands." Blake opened his mouth to argue, to beg, but nothing came out. He was trapped. The fear that had been eating at him since Jamal showed his badge now overwhelmed him. There was no way out. The chief sighed and leaned back. "Take the rest of the day off," he said quietly. "We'll meet tomorrow when Internal Affairs gets here. Until then, I suggest you get your story straight." Blake sat for a moment, numb. Then, without a word, he stood and left the office, the door closing with a soft thud behind him. On the other side of town, Jamal sat at his desk, typing up the report. The only sound in the room was the quiet clicking of his keyboard as he carefully recounted the incident. Blake's confrontation, the tension, and finally, the moment he revealed his badge. Jamal didn't exaggerate the details. He didn't have to. The facts spoke for themselves. He'd seen it too many times, officers letting their biases guide them, using their authority as a weapon. But it never made him any less angry. No matter how many times he saw it, the frustration never went away. Jamal paused, thinking back to the look on Blake's face when he showed the badge. The fear, the panic. It was real. But Jamal didn't feel any satisfaction from it. Blake had made his choices, and now he'd face the consequences. He finished the report and sent it off. The process had started. What happened to Blake now? Whether he'd lose his job, get suspended, or just get a slap on the wrist, wasn't for Jamal to decide. But he knew Blake wouldn't walk away unscathed. Not this time. Jamal leaned back, staring out the window. Jamal wasn't naive. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight. But he also knew that standing up, refusing to let things slide, was how progress was made. Blake would learn that lesson, one way or another. Blake sat at his kitchen table, staring down at the cold cup of coffee. His hands gripped the mug, but he hadn't taken a sip. The coffee had been cold for hours, but he couldn't bring himself to warm it up. He was too lost in thought, his mind consumed by what was ahead. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jamal's face, calm and collected as he flashed his FBI badge. The moment replayed in his head, like a nightmare that wouldn't stop. His stomach turned with a sick, empty feeling, and the quiet of his small apartment only made it worse. The conversation with Chief Roberts echoed in his mind. Internal affairs. He knew this day would come. The complaints had piled up over the years: harassment, racial profiling, excessive force. But the department had always shielded him because he always got results. But this time, there was no protection. Blake squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the thoughts, but they kept coming back, faster and louder. The humiliation of discovering Jamal had been an FBI agent cut deep. He had always prided himself on reading people, knowing when something was off, but Jamal had fooled him. Now, his career was at risk. A knock at the door jolted him back to reality, his heart pounding. He knew exactly who it was. Internal affairs never wasted time. Blake stood up slowly, his legs shaky. He walked to the door and opened it to find two men in plain suits, their faces serious. One of them flashed a badge. "Officer Blake?" the man asked, though he clearly already knew. Blake nodded, throat tight. "Yeah." "I'm Special Investigator Adams, and this is Investigator Lewis," the man said, nodding to his partner. "We're with Internal Affairs. We need to ask you a few questions about the incident with Mr. Jamal Washington." Blake's stomach turned at the sound of Jamal's name. The formality of it, Mr. Washington, made everything feel more real, more serious. Blake had never heard Jamal's full name before, and now that it was part of an investigation, he felt even more out of control. "Can we come in?" Adams asked, his voice flat but with an unspoken demand. Blake stepped aside, his mind racing as the two men entered. They sat at the kitchen table, their sharp suits a stark contrast to Blake's unshaven face and the dark circles under his eyes. The investigators didn't mention his appearance, but their eyes missed nothing. "We're here to talk about what happened in the parking lot," Adams said, pulling out a notepad. "Specifically, your interaction with Mr. Washington." Blake swallowed, his hands fidgeting. "I already talked to the chief," he said, his voice shaky. "We know," Lewis replied, his tone curt. "But this is a formal investigation. We need your side of the story." Blake's heart skipped a beat. He had dreaded this moment, the part where he'd have to explain himself. He didn't know how to do that without making things worse. But he knew if he didn't cooperate, it could get even worse. I thought he was acting suspicious," Blake began, his voice unsteady. "He was just standing there in the parking lot, looking around like he didn't belong." Adams raised an eyebrow. "Didn't belong? What do you mean by that?" Blake hesitated. He'd already made a mistake, using words that would make him look bad. But it was too late now. "He didn't look like someone who should be in that part of town," Blake stammered, his heart racing. "I thought maybe he was up to something. I was just doing my job." "And what exactly did he do to make you think that?" Lewis asked sharply. "Did he do anything suspicious, or was it just that he didn't look like he belonged?" Blake felt his face burn with shame. He had assumed, based on Jamal's appearance, that he was a threat. Now, sitting in front of these investigators, he could see how flimsy his reasoning was. He was loitering, Blake muttered, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. I thought maybe he was waiting for something, maybe a deal. I don't know. Adams and Lewis exchanged a glance, then Adams wrote something down. The sound of his pen scratching the paper filled the silence. "And when did you realize Mr. Washington was a federal agent?" Adams asked, his voice steady. This was the question Blake was trying to avoid. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Not until he showed me his badge." Lewis leaned forward. "And before that, how would you describe your behavior toward him?" Blake hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't make things worse. "I was just trying to get answers," he said weakly. "He wasn't cooperating. He was acting—" "Acting how?" Adams interrupted, his tone firm. Blake struggled for words. "He was too calm," he said, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "Like he wasn't taking me seriously." Adams scribbled more notes. "There have been complaints against you before, Officer Blake. Allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. How do you respond to that?" Blake's throat went dry. He knew the complaints would come up, they always did, but he had never had to answer for them before. The department had always covered for him. This time was different. "I was doing my job," Blake muttered, barely audible. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Lewis crossed his arms. "We'll see if Internal Affairs agrees with that." The words hit Blake like a punch. The investigators weren't just asking questions. They were here to decide if he had a future in law enforcement. The interview dragged on, each question digging deeper, each answer making Blake feel more exposed. By the time the investigators left, he was completely drained. "We'll be in touch," Adams said as they left. "Expect a formal hearing soon." Blake sat back down at the table, head in his hands. His career, his life, everything was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Across town, Jamal was taking care of his part of the process. He had just finished explaining the incident to his supervisor at the bureau. The FBI took these situations seriously, and Jamal knew once his report was filed, things would start moving. This wasn't about revenge. Jamal didn't care about punishing Blake personally. This wasn't about one man's downfall. It was about holding law enforcement accountable when they crossed the line. Blake wasn't the first officer to act this way, and he wouldn't be the last. But Jamal had the power to make sure that at least this time, something would be done. After hanging up the phone, Jamal's face was calm but serious. There was still work to do. The department would investigate, Internal Affairs would dig in, and the system would do what it was designed to do. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And Jamal was committed to seeing it through. He wasn't going to let this one slide. The next morning, Blake sat in his car outside the precinct, staring at the steering wheel. The air felt heavy, pressing down on him. He hadn't been able to sleep last night. The bags under his eyes and rough stubble made it clear he was falling apart. He couldn't bring himself to leave the car. He couldn't face his colleagues or their whispers. The rumors were already making rounds everywhere. It was only a matter of time before everyone knew what he'd done. His mind drifted back to the cafe, to Jamal's steady gaze as he flashed his FBI badge. That's when it all came crashing down. That was when Blake realized just how badly he had messed up. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew it wasn't just about Jamal. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was years of crossing lines, letting his bias take control. He had done it before, plenty of times. But this was the first time he had to face the consequences. Blake shifted in his seat, gripping the wheel as memories came flooding back. Each one hit harder than the last. 2 years ago, he pulled over a young black man in a nice car. Blake convinced himself the guy didn't belong in the neighborhood. He also didn't believe the guy could afford to buy a vehicle that nice. So his first instinct was that the man was a drug dealer or a thief. He questioned him for 20 minutes, searched the car without permission, and found nothing. The guy was a college student test driving his birthday gift from his parents. After the incident, the young man filed a complaint, but nothing came of it. Blake's supervisor wrote it off as a misunderstanding. Then there was the Latina woman a few months back. Blake accused her of shoplifting, even though she had her receipts right there. He demanded to see everything in her bags, treating her like a criminal. She was humiliated in front of her kids as she broke out in tears. Blake ignored the complaint that followed. He was sure he'd done nothing wrong. And there were other moments. Stopping cars for suspicious behavior, when really it was just the driver's race that caught his attention. Questioning people who didn't belong in certain neighborhoods. Every time Blake told himself it was justified. He thought he was keeping the streets safe. But now, sitting in his car, staring at the precinct, Blake felt the weight of all those moments. He had been wrong. So wrong. His chest tightened. His heart pounded as the truth sank in. He had never stopped to think about the people on the other side. He was always so sure he was in the right. But now, for the first time, he could see the damage he'd done. Blake's phone buzzed on the seat. It snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen, dread filling his stomach when he saw the name. Chief Roberts. His hands shook as he picked up. Yeah? His voice was rough. Blake. The chief's voice was short and sharp. I need you in my office. Now. Blake's throat tightened. He had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. I'll be there in a minute, he said, barely audible. He stared at himself in the rearview mirror. The man looking back wasn't the same. He was tired, broken, and scared of losing his job. Blake had always projected confidence, authority. Now, that was gone. He wasn't the man he thought he was. Taking a deep breath, Blake opened the car door. Each step toward the precinct felt heavier, like he was sinking into the ground. By the time he reached the door, his chest was burning with anxiety. As stepped inside, the precinct immediately went cold. He noticed the other officers watching him closely as he walked toward the captain's door. They whispered to each other as he passed. Some looked concerned. Others didn't care. Blake couldn't meet their eyes. He kept his head down and headed straight for Chief Roberts' office. When he reached the door, Blake hesitated. His hand hovered over the knob. He didn't want to go in. He didn't want to face what was coming next. But he had no choice. He opened the door and stepped inside. Chief Roberts sat behind his desk, not looking up. His eyes stayed on the file in front of him. The room felt cold, heavy with tension. Sit down, Blake, Roberts said, still not looking up. Blake sat, staring at the floor, his hands on his knees. His heart pounded, loud and fast. Finally, Roberts looked up, his gaze hard. Internal affairs is all over this, he said flatly. You've crossed the line before, but this time, you went too far. Blake stayed quiet. He couldn't argue. Roberts was right. You've got a record, Roberts said, flipping through the file. A long one, complaints, accusations. We let it go before, but now an FBI agent's filing a complaint. You know how serious that is? Blake swallowed hard. I didn't know who he was, he muttered. It doesn't matter who he was, Roberts snapped, slamming the file shut. That's the point. It doesn't matter if he was FBI or just some guy. You treated him like he was guilty from the moment you saw him. Now we're all paying for it. Blake clenched his fists, shame and anger swirling inside him. He wanted to defend himself, but he had nothing to say. He had no defense. I can't protect you anymore, Roberts said, softer now. "This investigation, it's going to bring everything to light. Every complaint. Every time you cross the line. IA's already digging into your file, and when they're done, you won't have anything left to stand on." Blake felt like the ground was dropping beneath him. He had always known the complaints were there. He just didn't think they'd catch up with him. Now, it was all falling apart. "I don't know how bad it's going to get," Roberts said, leaning back. "But you need to start thinking about what's next. You're not getting out of this clean." Blake's chest tightened. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about Jamal. It was his whole career, his reputation. Everything was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do. "Take some time," Roberts said quietly. "Figure out your next steps. Internal Affairs will be in touch soon. And when they are, it's out of my hands." Blake stood slowly, his legs shaky. It felt like he was moving through a fog as he headed for the door. "Blake," Roberts called after him, his voice softer now. "This could have all been avoided." Blake didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew that better than anyone. Jamal sat at his desk, the hum of the office in the background. His mind kept returning to the incident with Officer Blake. It had been days, but it still weighed heavily on him. His inbox was packed. Emails from Internal Affairs, questions from colleagues, and messages of support from friends who had heard what happened. Jamal had been in situations like this before, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher. Blake's aggression, the way he escalated things for no reason, stuck with Jamal like a bad taste. It wasn't just the disrespect, something Jamal had learned to deal with as a black man in law enforcement. What bothered him more was what it represented. Blake wasn't the first cop to cross a line, and Jamal knew he wouldn't be the last. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. He'd always believed in justice, that the system could be fixed from the inside. That belief had driven him to join the FBI. He wanted to be part of the solution, to show that people like him, black people, could wear the badge with integrity. But some days, like today, it was hard to keep that hope alive. Blake's actions were a reminder that the problems in law enforcement ran deep. It wasn't just bad cops like Blake. It was the culture that let them thrive. The silent nods, the way departments protected their own, even when they crossed a line. That's what Jamal had been fighting his whole career. Sometimes, it felt like a fight with no end. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Jamal glanced at the screen. A message from Marcus, a fellow FBI agent who had risen through the ranks with him. Marcus was black too. The message was brief. "Heard about the Internal Affairs investigation. How you holding up?" Jamal hesitated before typing back. "I'm good, just handling it. You know how it is." Marcus replied quickly, "Yeah, I know. Keep your head up, man. We've got your back." Jamal smiled a little, appreciating the support. He and Marcus had been through a lot, both navigating the challenges of being black in law enforcement. They had shared stories about microaggressions, about being doubted, about having to prove themselves time and again. But they'd also shared victories, earning respect through hard work. Jamal sighed and put his phone down. His thoughts shifted. He wasn't just thinking about Blake now. He thought about all the officers he had met over the years who let their biases guide their actions. He thought about the times he'd been pulled over as a young man, questioned for no reason except his skin color. He thought about his father's warnings about how to survive encounters with the police. And he thought about all the people who didn't have the shield of a badge. Jamal could pull out his FBI ID, but what about those who couldn't? What about the people treated like suspects just because of the color of their skin? The weight of it all settled over Jamal, but it didn't break him. It never had. If anything, it made him more determined. He remembered the moment in the cafe when he had finally shown his badge to Blake. The look on Blake's face, how his anger turned to shock and fear, had been a turning point. For a brief moment, Jamal had power, but he didn't enjoy it. He hadn't wanted to embarrass Blake. He wanted to make a point. The badge was supposed to stand for justice and integrity. Too often, it was used to oppress. Jamal wanted Blake to understand that his actions had consequences. But Jamal knew this wasn't just about one officer. Holding Blake accountable was important, but it was just a piece of a bigger puzzle. Real change would need more than this investigation. It would need a shift in how law enforcement saw its relationship with the community. Jamal exhaled slowly, the frustration giving way to determination. The investigation was moving forward. He would see it through. Blake's record would come under review, and the department would have to confront not just this incident, but the pattern behind it. Jamal wouldn't stop pushing until there was accountability, not just for Blake, but for the whole department. That afternoon, Jamal was in a meeting with his FBI superiors about the next steps in the investigation. They sat around a long table, the mood tense. Jamal was the only black agent in the room, but he was used to that. He'd spent most of his career being one of the few. But here, his colleagues respected him. They listened. Special Agent Thompson, his boss, flipped through a file as he spoke. "Jamal's report is clear," Thompson said. "Officer Blake crossed a line. The question is, what's the best way to proceed?" Another agent, an older man with gray hair, leaned forward. "We can push for action through internal affairs, but we need to tread carefully. Local departments get defensive when their officers are under the microscope." Jamal nodded. He knew the politics of it. Departments hated admitting one of their own had acted out of line. But Jamal didn't care about that. This was about more than just one cop getting what he deserved. It was about setting a standard. "I don't care if they're defensive," Jamal said calmly. "Blake needs to be held accountable. His record shows a pattern. If we let this slide, it sends the wrong message, to him and the whole department." Thompson nodded, though he looked cautious. "We'll push for accountability, but you know how this goes. It won't be easy." Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but that wasn't the point. "I'm not expecting it to be easy," Jamal replied. "I'm expecting it to be fair." The room fell quiet. His words hung in the air. His colleagues exchanged looks, but no one disagreed. They knew he was right. The meeting wrapped up soon after, but Jamal stayed seated for a moment as the others left. Thompson lingered, giving him a nod as he gathered his papers. "We're with you," Thompson said quietly. "Keep pushing. You're doing the right thing." Jamal nodded, but his mind was still racing. He knew he was doing the right thing, but sometimes that wasn't enough to change a system. He had been fighting this fight for years, and he wasn't about to stop now. As he stood and left the room, the tension in his chest hadn't eased, but his determination had grown stronger. This wasn't just about him, or Blake, or the department. This was about justice. And Jamal wasn't going to stop until it was served. Blake sat in the small, sterile conference room at the precinct, feeling the weight of the last few days crushing him. Across the table were the two internal affairs investigators, Adams and Lewis. Their faces gave nothing away as they flipped through a thick file, likely containing everything about his career. The room was cold. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound cutting through the tense silence. Blake cracked his fingers, trying to distract himself from whatever was coming. He felt exposed, like every mistake he'd ever made was about to be laid out in front of him, one by one. Adams glanced up, his sharp eyes locking onto Blake's. "We've been reviewing your record, Officer Blake," he said, his voice calm but with an edge. "It doesn't look good." Blake's heart pounded. He'd seen this coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. He always told himself that the complaints didn't matter. They were part of the job, part of keeping the streets clean. But now, with those complaints under a microscope, everything seemed like it was falling apart. Lewis flipped through more pages. "We've found several incidents in your file that follow the same pattern as the Washington case. Complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct. Can you explain why these keep happening?" Blake's mouth went dry. He didn't have a good answer. "I was doing my job," he muttered. The words felt empty in the cold room. "I thought I was doing what was best for the community." Adams raised an eyebrow. "And you think racial profiling is in the best interest of the community?" Blake's face drained of color. "That's not what I meant," he stammered, his voice cracking. "We've talked to several people involved in these complaints," Lewis cut in. His voice was sharp. "They paint a different picture of you. They say you target people based on race and escalate situations when it isn't necessary. This isn't just about one case. It's a pattern of behavior." Blake's hands clenched into fists under the table. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But no words came. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of the situation crushing him. The truth was, he couldn't deny what they were saying. He had crossed lines, many times. And now, it was catching up with him. Adams leaned forward. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Officer Blake?" Blake hesitated, searching for something, anything, that might save him. But there was nothing. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built was slipping away, and he couldn't stop it. I made mistakes," he finally admitted, barely above a whisper. The words tasted bitter, but he had no choice. "I didn't realize how far I was going." Adams sat back. "We'll submit our findings to the department soon. You should prepare for disciplinary action or worse." The words hit him like a punch. Disciplinary action, or worse. Blake's stomach twisted as reality sank in. He had always thought he was untouchable, that the department would always protect him. But now, that protection was gone. He was on his own. As Blake left the room, his legs felt weak. His mind was foggy with fear and regret. Every step felt heavy, like it might be his last in the precinct. He passed a few officers in the hallway. They glanced at him but quickly looked away. It was obvious everyone was trying to avoid him. He didn't blame them, as he would do the same in their position. No one was making small talk, no friendly nods. They knew what was happening. They knew he was under investigation, and they were all keeping their distance. Blake had always been a respected officer, even when complaints piled up. But now, that respect was fading. The whispers, the cold stares, it was all building, and Blake felt it slipping away. Walking through the station, Blake saw Officer Daniels, one of his closest colleagues. Daniels had always defended him, but when their eyes met, Daniels looked away, his face tight. "Daniels!" Blake called, his voice strained. "Got a minute?" Daniels hesitated, his hand on the break room door. For a second, it seemed like he might ignore Blake, but then he turned. His expression was unreadable. "What's up?" Blake stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've heard about internal affairs, right?" Daniels nodded stiffly, crossing his arms. "Yeah, I've heard." Blake's heart sank. The usual friendship banter was gone, replaced by a cold distance. "Look, man," Blake said, his voice shaky. "You know me. You know I was just doing my job. I need someone to vouch for me. You know I'm not what they're saying." Daniels looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. He wouldn't meet Blake's eyes. "Blake, I don't know what you want me to say," he muttered. It doesn't look good. Maybe it's best if you just lay low for a while." Blake felt a lump in his throat. He heard the unspoken message, "I'm not getting involved." His colleagues were turning their backs, distancing themselves from the trouble he was in. Without their support, Blake knew he was finished. "Right," Blake muttered, bitter. "Lay low." Daniels gave a small nod before walking away, leaving Blake standing alone in the hallway. Blake had always thought of the precinct as a brotherhood. But now, when he needed them most, they were nowhere to be found. Across town, Jamal watched quietly as everything started to unfold. The internal affairs investigation had picked up speed. Jamal had been getting updates from the department, and the new evidence even shocked him. Blake's record painted a clear picture of an officer who had abused his power, especially against people of color. It was what Jamal had suspected, but seeing it laid out so clearly still hit hard. Jamal wasn't naive. He knew Blake was part of a larger problem, a system that allowed officers like him to go unchecked for too long. But now, there was a chance to hold Blake accountable. This time, there would be consequences. Sitting at his desk, Jamal reviewed the latest internal affairs report. The wheels of justice were turning. It might take time, but there was no denying what the outcome will be. Soon, the department would have to make a decision about Blake's future. For Jamal, this wasn't about revenge. It was about sending a message. It was about showing that officers couldn't act like Blake had and get away with it. Closing the report, Jamal leaned back in his chair. His thoughts drifted to the parking lot confrontation. Blake had been so sure of his power, so sure he could control the situation. But Jamal had taken that power away, not with force, but with calm authority. And now, Blake was facing the consequences, just like he had warned him. Jamal knew this one case wouldn't change the whole system overnight, but it was a step toward accountability. And Jamal was ready to keep pushing, keep fighting until real change started happening. The morning of the disciplinary hearing arrived quickly. Blake had spent last night and the better half of the morning pacing his small apartment. The weight of everything that was happening hung over him like a heavy coat. He has not been able to sleep at night since the internal affairs investigation started. His uniform, once a symbol of pride and power, now felt like a burden. He had ironed it that morning, more out of habit than preparation. It didn't matter. There was no way to prepare for what was coming. Sitting in his car outside the precinct, the usual city noise seemed to fade. All he could hear was his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. His mind raced, replaying the investigation. Every word he had said to Internal Affairs ran through his head. He had tried to defend himself, to justify his actions, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The truth was there, staring back at him. He had crossed the line. Blake gripped the steering wheel, closing his eyes as he tried to calm the storm of emotions inside him. The hearing would decide everything. If they suspended him, or worse, fired him, it would all be over. His career, everything he had worked for, would be gone. All because of one mistake. No, he corrected himself, because of a series of mistakes. Years of ignoring the warnings, brushing off complaints, convincing himself he was doing the right thing. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to open the car door. The cool morning air hit him as he stepped out. His legs were heavy. Each step toward the building felt like he was walking into a future he couldn't control. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The usual buzz of activity was replaced by whispers. The hearing had cast a dark cloud over everyone. Blake felt the eyes of his colleagues on him as he walked through the hallway. No one spoke. No one offered him a nod or a word of support. It was as if he had already disappeared. He reached the conference room door and hesitated. His hand hovered over the knob. This was it. No turning back now. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was cold, sterile, much like the one where Internal Affairs had interrogated him. Chief Roberts sat at the long table, along with a representative from Internal Affairs and 2 members of the disciplinary board. Their faces were unreadable. At the corner of the room, Jamal sat quietly, a stark reminder of why they were all there. Blake's heart skipped when he saw Jamal. This was the man who had exposed everything, the one who had brought his actions to light. But Blake couldn't blame him. Jamal had done what he had to do. It wasn't personal. It was about justice. Chief Roberts gestured for Blake to take a seat at the end of the table. Blake sat down slowly, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. The room was unbearably quiet with the tension thick in the air. The Internal Affairs representative, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, cleared her throat. "Officer Blake," she began, her voice steady. "We're here to discuss the findings of the investigation into your conduct, specifically the incident with Mr. Jamal Washington." Blake swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, and his pulse raced. Every nerve in his body was on edge. "The investigation," she continued, "revealed a pattern of misconduct in your record, particularly regarding racial profiling and excessive force. The department has received multiple complaints over the years. The incident with Mr. Washington is part of a long series of concerning behavior." Her words hit Blake like a punch to the gut. Multiple complaints. Pattern of misconduct. Each phrase felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. "We've reviewed everything," she said, glancing at the others. "Based on the evidence, your actions were not an isolated incident. They're part of a larger issue, a problem we can no longer ignore." Blake clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that he had just been doing his job. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The evidence was clear, and there was no escaping it. "We are recommending disciplinary action," she said, her voice firm. "Effective immediately, you'll be suspended without pay pending further review. The department will also implement mandatory training on racial bias and proper conduct for all officers as a direct result of this investigation." Blake's heart sank. Suspended. He had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. His career wasn't over yet, but it was hanging by a thread, and the chances of coming back from this were slim. Chief Roberts leaned forward, his face serious but softer. "Blake," he said quietly, "you've been with us for a long time, but this is something we can't overlook. We're giving you a chance to learn from this, but your actions have consequences. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the whole department." Blake nodded slowly. His mind was numb, barely processing the words. He had expected worse, maybe even being fired. But suspension still felt like a crushing blow. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of everything pressing down harder. The woman from Internal Affairs spoke again, this time to Jamal. "Mr. Washington, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Your cooperation has been invaluable." Jamal, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity. "I appreciate the department taking this seriously," he said, glancing at Blake before focusing on the board. "But this can't stop here. It's not just about one officer. The department needs to take a hard look at its culture, at how officers like Blake have been allowed to operate unchecked for so long." Blake felt a wave of guilt. Jamal wasn't just talking about him. He was talking about the system that had protected him for years. Blake had been shielded because he got results, but those results had come at a cost. Chief Roberts nodded, his face thoughtful. "You're right, Mr. Washington. This is something we need to address on a larger scale. That's why we're rolling out new training programs and reviewing our internal policies. We can't let this happen again." Jamal gave a small nod, but Blake could tell he wasn't fully satisfied. Jamal had seen the worst of the system, and he wasn't going to settle for half measures. He wanted real change. The hearing wrapped up quickly after that. The decision was made. Blake would be suspended, the department would undergo training, and Jamal would leave knowing at least one officer had been held accountable. But as Blake stood to leave, the weight of his suspension felt heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Later that day, Jamal sat in his office reflecting on the hearing. It hadn't been easy. Blake's suspension was a step in the right direction, but Jamal knew this was far from over. One officer facing consequences wouldn't fix the department's deeper problems. There was still so much to do. So many officers who needed to be held accountable, so many policies that needed to change. For now, though, Jamal felt a small sense of accomplishment. He had done what he set out to do. He had made his voice heard. Officer Blake wouldn't be able to continue without consequences. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Sitting back in his chair, Jamal thought about the people who didn't have the same power he did, the ones who couldn't flash an FBI badge to get officers like Blake to back down. He thought about the communities hurt by officers abusing their power, the families torn apart by unnecessary violence. Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. Blake sat in his dark living room. The weight of the last few days had left him a shadow of his former self. It had been almost a week since his suspension, but it still didn't seem real. His badge and gun were gone, locked up at the precinct, and without them, he felt like a part of him was missing. The TV played in the background, but Blake wasn't paying attention. The news reports and talk shows blurred together as his mind tried to figure out his next move. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. All the what-ifs swirled in his head. What if he hadn't confronted Jamal? What if he had just walked away like any reasonable officer would have? What if he had listened to the complaints over the years, taken a step back, and thought about his actions? But it was too late now. The damage was done. Blake leaned forward, running his hands through his hair, his stomach tight with anxiety. His phone sat on the coffee table, silent and dark. No calls, no messages. He had not heard from his colleagues. Even those he had thought were his friends had not reached out to him. Daniels, who had been close to him, hadn't even texted to know how he was holding up. Blake had tried calling, but no one answered. Blake felt completely alone. The precinct had been his whole life. He'd always thought of himself as a tough cop, the kind of guy who could handle anything. But now, sitting in the quiet of his empty apartment, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. Blake had seen this happen to other officers, guys who got caught up in something and ended up on the wrong side of an investigation. The department would leave them to deal with it on their own, forgetting about all the years they'd served. He had always thought he was different, that he would never be in their shoes. Now, with the news of his suspension setting in, he realized how quickly it could all come falling apart. Blake's phone buzzed, yanking him out of his thoughts. His heart jumped as he reached for his phone, hoping that it was someone from the precinct with good news. As he picked up the phone, his heart skipped a beat immediately. Blake swiped the screen over to read the headline. Local officer suspended amid internal affairs investigation, racial profiling and misconduct allegations surface. His stomach growled anxiously as he scrolled through the article. It was about him, his suspension, the investigation, the complaints, all laid out for everyone to see. His name was there for the public to judge. alongside quotes from community members, some of whom had filed complaints against him in the past. Blake's hands trembled as he read the comments below the article. People were furious, calling for him to resign, demanding he be fired. Some even wanted him prosecuted. Others mocked him, calling him a disgrace to the badge. He flung his phone onto the couch, his breathing rapid and shallow. The walls of his apartment closed in around him. He knew that investigation would mean some fallout, but every minute that his dirty laundry was being aired in public was too much for him to bear. Blake got up and started to pace across the room, his mind racing. His career was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't do a thing to stop that. The department wasn't going to save him. His colleagues weren't going to back him up. And now, the public had turned against him. Anger surged through him, the same anger that had driven his confrontation with Jamal, the same anger that had fueled so many of his decisions over the years. He wanted to lash out, to blame someone, anyone, for what was happening. But as he stood there, fists clenched, he realized there was no one to blame but himself. The truth hit him hard. He had crossed the line too many times. He had ignored the warnings and shrugged off the complaints, and now he was paying the price. Blake sat back onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. For years, he'd thought himself untouchable. He believed nothing was capable of bringing him down. Now, without his badge, his authority, and the respect of his peers, Blake felt naked. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the effects of Blake's suspension were still being felt. Jamal's complaint did not just take Blake down. It forced the department to confront its own problems. The disciplinary board had ordered new training on racial bias and proper conduct, and for the first time in years, the precinct was under heavy scrutiny. Officers whispered about the changes. Some were irritated, others anxious. There was a growing tension in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Jamal moved through the precinct like usual, calm and collected, but he could sense the shift. He had become a symbol of the changes happening around him. Whether people saw him as a hero or a troublemaker depended on who you asked. Some respected him for speaking up, for pushing the department to take responsibility. Others resented him for it. As Jamal made his way to a meeting with Chief Roberts, he caught snippets of conversation. His name came up more than once, followed by hushed voices and sideways glances. By now, he was used to it, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. When Jamal reached the chief's office, the door was open. Roberts looked up from his desk, looking tired from the events of the past few days. "Come in, Jamal," he said, waving him inside. Jamal sat down, relaxed but focused. Roberts leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's been a long few weeks," he said quietly, "but I want to thank you for how you've handled things. You've been steady, and that's what we needed." Jamal nodded. "I appreciate that, Chief, but there's still a lot more to do." Roberts sighed, leaning forward, his face serious. "I know. Blake's suspension is just the beginning. We're under heavy scrutiny now, and we have to make real changes." Jamal was glad to hear Roberts admit that, but he knew real change wouldn't come overnight. The investigation into Blake had sparked something, but it would take more than suspending one officer to fix the deep problems in the department. "I think the training is a good step," Jamal said, choosing his words carefully. "But it has to be more than a few sessions on bias. The culture here needs to shift. Officers need to understand that their actions have real consequences." Roberts nodded, but his face remained grim. "You're right. I'll do everything I can. But you know how it is. Some of the guys are nervous. They see what's happening with Blake, and they're scared they'll be next." Jamal leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe they should be. Roberts met his gaze, understanding passing between them. Maybe they should. They sat in silence for a moment as they digested what they had discussed. Jamal knew Roberts meant well, but he also knew change wouldn't come easily. This was just the start. Blake's suspension was still the top gist in the days that followed. Rumors were going around that more officers were being investigated, and that Blake's case had opened the door to a wider inquiry into misconduct. This development had most officers being more careful, while others resisted these changes, frustrated by the growing scrutiny. But Jamal was not about to give in. Blake's suspension was a good first step, but it wasn't enough. He'd seen too many incidents like this one swept under the rug, too many officers allowed to go on abusing their power. This time, things had to be different. As he walked through the precinct at the end of another long day, he felt quite determined in his decision to oversee the training changes in the police department. He knew the road ahead would be hard, and change wouldn't come easy, but he was ready for the fight. Blake sat alone in his apartment, lost in thought. The noise of the city outside slowly faded away. It had been days since his disciplinary hearing, days since they finalized his suspension, but the full weight of it still hadn't hit him. It was as if he were moving through a thick fog, unsure of where he was headed or what was real anymore. Each day passed in a blur of regret and confusion. His apartment, usually full of signs of his life as a cop, his uniform draped over a chair, his equipment belt hanging near the door, now felt strangely empty. His badge and gun had been taken from him, and without them, Blake felt out of place, even in his own home. What used to be a haven, a break from the pressures of his job, now felt like a prison, a constant reminder of all he had lost. His phone lay face down on the coffee table in front of him. He hadn't touched it in hours. The isolation had grown heavier with each passing day, and it ate at him in ways he hadn't expected. Before this, Blake had always believed he was part of something bigger. The precinct was his family, his team, the place where he belonged. But now, that family had turned its back on him. The colleagues he had worked with for years distanced themselves from him as if his suspension was contagious. Even Daniels, the one guy he thought would have his back, was no longer returning his calls. Blake leaned forward, burying his head in his hands. The weight of it all was crushing him. Shame, regret, and anger twisted inside him, leaving him hollow and sad. All these years, he had assured himself that he was doing just right. Every stop, every confrontation, every time he bent. The rules was all justified because he was keeping the community safe. But sitting alone now in his empty apartment, the truth was impossible to avoid. He had crossed the line too many times, and now it was all coming back to roost. The news about his suspension only made things worse. Seeing his name dragged through the mud, reading the comments from people who had filed complaints, it had been a brutal reality check. He had always brushed off those complaints as part of the job. He told himself the people making them were just mad or didn't understand the dangers he faced. But now, there was no more denying it. Those people had been right. Blake stood, pacing the small living room. He could still feel the anger, simmering just beneath the surface, but it felt different. He wasn't mad at Jamal, or the department, or the disciplinary board anymore. He was mad at himself. He had always believed he was a good cop, a guy who got results no matter what. Now, finally, the truth stared him in the face. He had allowed his anger, bias, and pride to consume him. Now, he was paying for it. Blake stopped in front of the window, staring at the city life below. Life continued to go on. It didn't have one single clue about the storm he was fighting within himself. For the first time in his life, Blake had never felt so small. Meanwhile, as Blake was battling his demons, Jamal sat in a cafe, sipping his coffee as he checked his phone. The precinct had been a hive of activities since Blake's suspension, with fresh training programs and internal reviews taking the department by storm. Jamal knew some of the officers were frustrated with the changes, with some grumbling about political correctness and overreach, while some officers also agreed the department needed to take a hard look at how it operated. To Jamal, this wasn't the end of the road for Blake's suspension. It was just the beginning. But if anything, his actions had catalyzed a deeper conversation about accountability, one most definitely not going to be easy. Jamal scanned through the latest news articles covering Blake's suspension. The community had taken notice. Some people were relieved, glad that the department was finally addressing issues like racial profiling, but others were skeptical that it could bring about real change. They had seen officers get punished before, only for the department to sweep it under the rug later. Jamal understood their doubts. The system was broken in so many ways, and holding one officer accountable wasn't going to fix it. But it was a start. He thought back to the day of the confrontation with Blake. He had kept his cool, even when Blake pushed things to the point where most people would have lost it. Jamal had learned long ago that staying calm was a kind of power. When faced with someone like Blake, who thrived on intimidation, keeping your composure was key. But even now, after the hearing, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation had exposed something deeper. Blake wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symptom of a much bigger problem. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus, his friend at the FBI. "Saw the news about Blake. How are things on your end?" Jamal typed back, "It's moving. The department's under pressure, but we'll see how far it goes." Marcus responded quickly, "You think they'll make real changes?" Jamal paused before replying, "Hard to say. Too early to tell. But we're pushing." He set his phone down and looked around the cafe, watching people go about their day. The fight for accountability was a slow one, full of setbacks and small wins. Jamal knew that better than anyone. He'd been here before, pushing for change in a system that resisted it, but this time felt different. Blake's suspension had sent shockwaves through the precinct. Some officers took it as a warning, quietly changing their behavior. Others dug in their heels, doubling down. But no matter how they felt about it, everyone knew the tide was shifting, and it was change or be kicked out. Jamal thought about Blake again. He hadn't seen him since the hearing, but the whispers around the precinct were hard to miss. Blake had become an outcast, left to deal with the fallout on his own. Jamal didn't feel sorry for him, not after everything, but he didn't take any satisfaction from it either. To him, this wasn't about revenge. It was strictly about justice. Jamal finished his coffee and headed back to the precinct. He knew the road ahead was long, filled with obstacles. But every step forward, every officer held accountable, was a step toward a better system. As he walked through the busy streets, Jamal felt even more determined than before. The work wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Meanwhile, Blake's isolation got even worse. Each passing day added to the weight of his silence. The calls that never came, the messages that went unanswered. He couldn't believe it as he watched the life he had worked so hard to build fall apart. He had become invisible, a man without purpose or direction. For the first time, Blake didn't know who he was. He had always defined himself by his badge, by the authority it gave him. But now, that authority was gone and he was just plain Blake. A man who had made one mistake too many, who had allowed his anger and pride to ruin everything. As he sat in the dark, he thought of everything he had lost. He'd lost it all: job, respect, identity, And most terrifying of all was that he knew he had nobody to blame but himself. Blake had not been out of his apartment for days on end. The air was thick inside with stale old coffee and leftover food. Takeout containers littered the space, adding to the mess. The room was dark, sunlight barely creeping through the heavy drapes he had pulled shut. He wasn't ready to face the outside world. He spent most of his days on the couch staring blankly at the TV. He couldn't bear to watch the news anymore. His name was always in the headlines and used as some kind of example of everything wrong with the police. Some even went to mention other officers from around the country to explain how he had been part of a bigger problem: police misconduct. At first, he had been furious. The anger burned inside him. The headlines and public outcry seemed so unfair. He wasn't a monster. He thought he was doing what was right, but after weeks of being alone, with no one to tell him differently, the anger started to fade. Slowly, he began to realize something. Maybe the anger was misplaced. The more time he spent thinking, the more the truth hit him. He had created this mess, and now he had to deal with it. Blake stood up, pacing the living room, lost in thought. The past few weeks were a blur of guilt, shame, and regret. The reality of his suspension weighed on him more each day. He had no idea what his future held. Would he ever wear the badge again? Did he even deserve to? Every time he thought about what happened with Jamal, he felt disgusted with himself. Jamal had looked at him so calmly, like he had expected Blake to react exactly the way he did. And Jamal was right. Blake had lost control, letting his frustration and prejudice guide his actions. Blake didn't want to admit it, but in those quiet moments when the anger faded, he saw the truth. He had been wrong. He walked over to the window and pulled the curtains back a little to look outside. Life outside went on like normal. People walked around, unaware of what was going on inside Blake's apartment. He watched them for a moment, feeling completely disconnected. This used to be his city. He used to be part of it. Now, without his uniform or his badge, he felt like a stranger. He turned away from the window and sank back onto the couch, sighing heavily. His mind drifted to the last conversation he'd had with Chief Roberts after the disciplinary hearing. Roberts had been blunt. He told Blake that the department wouldn't protect him anymore. That had been hard to hear. For years, Blake had counted on the department to cover for him, to hide his mistakes. But now, everything had changed. The complaints weren't ignored anymore. The public was paying attention. Worse yet, his fellow officers were too. Blake wasn't the hero anymore. He wasn't the tough cop who got things done. Now, he was part of the problem. Blake rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the scratch of his unshaven beard. It was becoming clear. He had no one to blame but himself. He had pushed too hard, acted out of anger, and let his biases control him. It wasn't just about what happened with Jamal. It was about years of bad decisions, years of ignoring that voice inside him that told him to slow down, to think before acting. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Blake stared at it for a moment before picking it up. The number wasn't familiar, but something made him answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice rough. "Blake, it's Daniels." Blake's heart skipped a beat. Daniels hadn't called him since the suspension. "Daniels, hey," Blake replied, trying to sound calm, but his voice cracked. There was a long pause. Daniels seemed to be searching for the right words. "I just wanted to check in," Daniels said finally. "I know things have been tough, and I should have reached out sooner, but it's all a mess right now." Blake nodded, even though Daniels couldn't see him. "Yeah, I get it. The precinct's changed a lot since your suspension," Daniels continued. "Everything's tense. They're pushing racial bias training and all these new rules. People are on edge, scared they'll be next. Blake felt a wave of guilt. He knew his actions had triggered the changes, but hearing how it affected the department made it worse. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Blake muttered. "I know," Daniels said softly, "but you have to understand, things needed to change. You can't keep doing the same things. Not in today's world. People are paying attention. There's no room for mistakes anymore." Blake didn't reply. Daniels was right, but that didn't make it easier to hear. "Look," Daniels added, his voice hesitant, "I don't know what's going to happen with you, but I hope you take this time to figure things out. The Blake I knew, he wasn't a bad guy. You just lost your way." Blake swallowed hard. Those words hit him harder than he expected. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe." There was a long pause before Daniels said, "Take care of yourself," and hung up. Blake stared at the phone for a while after the call ended. The silence closed in on him again. Daniels was right. Blake had lost his way. Now he had to decide if he wanted to try and fix things, or let it all fall apart. Across town, Jamal sat in his office, supervising some of the training programs he was handling with the precinct. The last few weeks had been hectic. Endless meetings, reports, and training sessions. The department had rolled out the racial bias training quickly, trying to show they were serious about change. Jamal had sat through some of the sessions, watching officers react. Some were engaged, others frustrated by the changes. The tension was thick. Jamal knew this was just the beginning. Real change would take time, but it was a start. As he typed up a report on his computer, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Any news on Blake?" Jamal hesitated before replying. "Suspended without pay. It's over for now." Marcus texted back quickly. "Think he'll try to come back?" Jamal thought about it. Blake had been stubborn at first, refusing to admit he'd done anything wrong. But as the investigation went on, he had become a different person. At the disciplinary hearing, Blake had looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, eyes down. The man who once seemed so sure of himself now looked lost. "I don't know," Jamal replied. "Maybe, but he's not the same." Marcus replied simply, "Good." Jamal set his phone down, leaning back in his chair. Blake's suspension had shaken the department, but it wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had allowed behavior like his to go unchecked for too long. Jamal knew the real work was just beginning. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the buildings below. From up here, everything seemed calm, but Jamal knew the challenges ahead were far from over. He thought about Blake, about the man who had stood in that parking lot, yelling, trying to assert his power. Blake had been wrong, but Jamal didn't hate him. He'd seen too many men like Blake, shaped by a system that valued aggression over empathy. Blake wasn't unique. He was just another part of the machine. But now, the machine was changing. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace. Blake had been held accountable, and the department had been forced to confront its issues. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. For now, that was enough. As the sun disappeared behind the buildings, Jamal turned from the window and sat back at his desk. The work never ended, but that was part of the job. Accountability didn't come easy, and for every step forward, there would always be more obstacles. But Jamal knew that real change took time and persistence. Blake's case had been a hard fight, but it had left a mark. Not just on the department, but on Jamal too. He had seen too many people like Blake get away with abusing their power because no one stood up. But this time, it had been different. This time, there were consequences. The precinct was quieter now. Most officers had left on patrol duty. Jamal looked at the clock and realized it was time for him to go too. As he gathered his things, he couldn't help but wonder what Blake was doing, how he was dealing with everything. Jamal didn't take joy in Blake's downfall. For Jamal, it had always been about the bigger picture. He wanted to send a message, not just to Blake, but to the entire department. How they wore the badge mattered, how they treated people mattered, and those who crossed the line would be held accountable, no matter what. Jamal picked up his phone one last time, scrolling through messages. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new conflicts, but that was the nature of the job. With a quiet sigh, Jamal slipped his phone into his pocket and grabbed his jacket. As he walked out of the precinct, he felt a sense of resolve. The fight for justice wasn't over, but today they had made progress. The department was changing, one step at a time. Blake sat on his couch, surrounded by darkness. He had turned off the lights hours ago. The shadows felt better than the harsh light of reality. His phone was on the table beside him, untouched since Daniels called. That conversation left him feeling empty. He didn't know who he was anymore, or what to do next. Daniels had been right. Blake had lost his way. But the worst part was that he didn't know how to get back. The man he once was, the officer who walked into the precinct with confidence, sure of himself, was gone. Now, he didn't even recognize himself. Blake leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His mind drifted to the parking lot, the moment Jamal showed his FBI badge. That was when everything fell apart. For the first time, Blake realized his authority wasn't as strong as he thought. He used to believe his badge gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. But Jamal had made him see things differently. Jamal wasn't scared. He didn't back down, even when Blake tried to push him. That's what shook Blake the most. His power wasn't unbreakable. Now, without his badge, Blake felt lost. The identity he held on to for so long was slipping away. All that was left were regrets. He thought about the people he had wronged, the complaints that were ignored, the faces of those he treated unfairly. It was all catching up to him. For the first time, Blake wondered if he even deserved a second chance. Could he fix the damage he had done? The thought weighed him down. He didn't have the answer. But he knew one thing. He couldn't keep hiding from it. Blake stood up slowly, the events of the past few weeks weighing on him. He walked to the window and pulled the curtains open. He looked out at the city below. The streets were still busy, even this late. For the first time in a long while, Blake felt a little bit better. He wanted to be part of the world again. He wasn't sure what the future held. His suspension could turn into something permanent, and even if it didn't, Blake wasn't sure he could go back to the precinct after everything. But as he stood there, looking at the world he once thought he was protecting, Blake realized something. The truth was simple. He had been wrong. He had let anger and bias control him, and because of that, he hurt people. But maybe, just maybe, he could still make things right. Blake let out a long breath. He felt a strange calm come over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jamal walked down the street, the cool night air brushing his face. He always liked walking at night. The city felt different. It was quieter, calmer. Tonight, as he headed home, he felt the weight of the past few weeks, but it didn't bother him. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Blake's case was a victory in its own way. It forced the department to take a hard look at itself, to deal with problems that had been ignored for too long. But Jamal knew real change didn't happen overnight. The fight for accountability was never easy, and it never ended. As he turned onto his street, Jamal thought about the future. There would be more officers like Blake. There would be more confrontations, more battles, but he was ready. He chose this path for a reason. He wanted to stand up for what was right. He wanted to make sure the people ignored by the system had a voice. He thought about Blake again, wondering if the man had learned anything from this. Jamal didn't hate him. He didn't even wish him harm. All he wanted was for Blake to understand why he was wrong, to take responsibility, to change. Maybe that would happen. Maybe it wouldn't. But Jamal had done his part. He pushed for justice, and he would keep doing so for as long as it took. As he reached his apartment, Jamal paused and looked up at the stars. They were barely visible, but he knew they were there. The world kept moving. Things kept changing. And Jamal was ready to keep moving too. With one last deep breath, Jamal went inside, ready for whatever came next. A few weeks had passed since the incident. Jamal was driving around, running errands, when he found himself near the cafe where it all started. It wasn't planned. His mind was busy with the usual flood of tasks, but as he got closer to the familiar street corner, something made him slow down. The small cafe with its dark green awning and outdoor seating looked just like it did that afternoon. Jamal hadn't been back since the confrontation with Blake. He hadn't planned to stop now either, but as he pulled into the parking lot, the memories rushed back. He remembered the heated words, the tension, and the moment when Blake's aggression clashed with his calm. He parked the car and sat for a moment, taking it all in. The parking lot was the same, almost unchanged. The only difference now was the quiet. There were no raised voices, no confrontation, just the hum of people going about their day, unaware of what this place meant to Jamal. Stepping out of the car, he walked slowly, his mind replaying the events of that day. He could still hear Blake's angry voice, accusing him of loitering, demanding to know why he was there. Jamal had stayed calm, but he knew the situation could escalate. It wasn't the first time he'd been in such a position, but something about this time was different. This time, Jamal pushed back, not with anger, but with quiet strength, and that had shifted the power in the situation. He reached the spot where he had stood during the confrontation. Closing his eyes for a moment, Jamal let the emotions wash over him. He hadn't been afraid, not of Blake, not of what could happen, but there was a weight to it, a heaviness in knowing these encounters happened too often to too many people. That was what stayed with him, long after the moment passed. Opening his eyes, Jamal looked at the cafe. The people inside now, sipping coffee and chatting, probably had no idea what this place meant to him. He remembered walking in that day, trying to stay calm, trying to keep it together for Ms. Davis. Then Blake had followed him, still angry, still pushing. That's when things shifted. Jamal had shown his badge and taken control. The weight of that moment lingered with Jamal, but now, standing in the same spot, he felt something else too. A sense of closure. The investigation was over. Blake had faced consequences, and the department was forced to look at its failures. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jamal turned toward the cafe, feeling the urge to go inside. He had been pushing forward for so long, always focused on the next challenge. But here, where it all began, he felt like he could take a moment. Just breathe. He walked inside, greeted by the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of conversation. He found an empty table by the window and sat down, his eyes drifting back to the parking lot. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the pavement. For the first time in a while, Jamal felt at peace. He had done what he needed to do. Blake had been held accountable. The department was making progress. There was still work to be done, but for now he let himself relax. Taking a deep breath, Jamal felt the tension in his chest ease. this cafe, this parking lot. It had been a turning point, not just for Blake, but for him too. This was where he had shown himself that he had power, not just as an FBI agent, but as a man who refused to back down in the face of injustice. This was where he showed Blake, and anyone watching, that calm strength could overcome anger, that doing the right thing didn't need shouting or violence. It needed conviction. He watched as a few cars pulled into the lot, their drivers stepping out and heading inside, unaware of what had happened here weeks ago. Life moved on, and so would Jamal. But this place, this moment, would stay with him. After some time, Jamal stood up, paid for his coffee, and stepped outside. The parking lot was quiet, bathed in the soft light of dusk. It felt different now, calmer. As he walked back to his car, he took one last look around. Everything seemed quieter, more peaceful. Jamal drove away, ready for whatever came next. He knew he had made a difference, and that he would keep making a difference, one step at a time.